Thank you very much, Duncan, for those kind words. Before launching into my subject, imagining a philosophy of creative literary translation, or rather beginning to imagine a philosophy of creative literary translation, I would like briefly to revisit the guiding principles of my own translational practice. If I were reading instructions in a foreign language, my principal concern would be to discover what they meant, rather than how they would be expressed in my own language. It is much easier to say what they mean than how they would be expressed in my own language, because the question is, more properly, how might they be expressed in my own language? That is, how many signifiers in my language do these instructions make possible? The real function of translation is to explore this multiplicity of possible signifiers and to understand what each entails as a response to the original. This clearly is something that a monoglot reader, a reader who does not know the language of the original, cannot do. And it is because of this condition of the monoglot reader that the translator, we might claim, tends to give priority to the signified. That is, asks what the text really means, a problem of interpretation, rather than what responses and what senses it makes possible in different versions of itself. Translation, for the monoglot reader, thus seems to me one necessary function of translation, but not the function that does best justice to the act of translation and its literary possibilities. I propose a version of translation which is concerned not with the interpretation of text, but with an account of the phenomenology of reading. That is, a translation not of the meaning of the text, but of the reader's experience of text. Not of the linguistic content, but of the activity of readerly consciousness in language. Translation then becomes the process of writing that experience, that activity of readerly consciousness, back into the source text as the objective of the target text, with the added implication that all reading should turn into a writing, into translation, and that every reader of a translation should treat that translation as an invitation or provocation for them to become a translator in their turn. In the world of translation, no text stops wanting and needing to become something else, and every translation seeks to multiply. The reader for whom my translation is designed, given the objectives just expressed, is what I call the polyglot reader, the reader who already understands the source text or source language. Finally, I should just say that translation does not attempt to preserve the source text, but to project it into the future, into its possible futures. The source text is a piece of living literature, available for infinite reauthoring. Fidelity in translation is a recipe for fossilization and anachronism. To take a source text forward is not, however, necessarily to radically change its textual substance. It is to change the expressive range and reach of that textual substance by incorporating the knowledge and experience that the reader brings to it. And I just want to, as a taster, this is an extract from a poem by Blaise Cendrars called Tours. It's about the Eiffel Tower. Au cœur de l'Afrique, c'est toi qui cours, girafe, autruche, boa, and so on. In translating it, I redistribute the text in order to change its dynamic, in order to introduce into it of travelling. I also vary typefaces so that further suggest certain changes of tone, certain changes of amplitude, actually, in the text. Next, I introduce handwriting and doodling, which are the kind of taps, the think aloud protocols of the semi-conscious, the unconscious even mind, as it makes spontaneous associations. Then I introduce further fragments of photographs. That is to say that even as I'm translating, what I'm trying to do is register incoming information from the world around me. Translation doesn't stop the world from happening, and I must let that world actually into the translation that I'm doing. And you'll also see that there are these arabesques of enamel paint, which again carry on the idea of something pre-reflexive, something rather like action painting, something which underlines the sense that translation is process, pure process. Much of the thinking that translation studies devotes to translation lies in establishing relationships between, on the one hand, theories, variously drawn from linguistics, cultural studies, literary studies, theories connected with, say, gender or post-colonial studies, or pragmatics or hermeneutics, and practices on the other, such that methodologies can be formulated and strategies devised from which individual translators can select the approach most congenial to their own persuasion. Translation's long history, the clarity of its function hitherto, that is, to make texts in foreign languages accessible to those without knowledge of those languages, have made the question, why translate, seem virtually unnecessary. But if the reader already understands the original text, is a polyglot reader, then such a question is necessary, and its answer depends less on what translation is than on what it does and how it works. How does translation act in and on the world? Translation is not just a service, it is a project of relationship. It is a way of creating literary futures whose instruments are the fundamentally human activities of reading and writing. How can translation change consciousness? What kind of expressive experience does it attach to reading and writing? How does it change our perception of language? What kind of existential values does it promote? How does it position us ecologically and environmentally? These questions, it seems to me, relate precisely to a philosophy of translation rather than to any kind of theory. Of course, they have consequences for practice, but it is likely that the translator who has pondered them will feel thereafter that he or she is serving the enterprise of translation rather than any particular text, that any particular text is only an agent of larger translational designs. One is not a translator by professional qualification, not even by virtue of skills, however much these may affect the quality of the product. One is a translator by conviction, by the conviction that translation is an inescapable practice, a ameliorative practice, a practice which immerses one more fully in the sensible world and its community. Translation, then, is the pursuit of particular kinds of knowledge and self-knowledge. The knowledges which derive from reading, knowledges which we must learn how to write in the practice of translation. Translation does not use knowledge, history, dictionary, thesaurus. It comes to knowledge. Translation is not an objective, something that one can repeatedly be done with when completed, something that works itself out in a resolution. Translation is a mode of literary being through which one engages in translation-specific ways, as we've said, with epistemology, with ecology, with ethnography and anthropology, with aesthetics, with the relationship between language and perception, with a relationship between the written and the oral, with a relationship between languages and between literatures. Translation, then, is a weighty undertaking. The translator, in addressing the various challenges of individual texts, is always equally addressing the fortunes and future of translation itself, not only as a medium or art, but also as an agent of consciousness and being in the world. Let us begin at the beginning. The source text, the text to be translated, already exists. It has built a reputation for itself which seems to wish it to stay as it is. If it does change, will it continue to deserve its reputation? But nobody knows how it can be kept unchanged in another language. What in another language would constitute its unchangedness? It also seems that if it is to exist now, in this very present, it must change in order to shake itself free from its then, in order not to repeat itself anachronistically. But we do not know what it might be now either. This is indeed perhaps the underlying question of all translation. The text must be changed, and by that very process become subject to further change indefinitely. We stop asking, what does it mean? Against which, what doesn't it mean, acts only as a useful control, knowing that we cannot express that meaning in another language. We ask instead, what senses can it have? And immediately it multiplies, becomes metamorphic, polymorphic, and immediately the question, what senses can't it have, becomes not a control, but a challenge, an estimation of the vastness of its possibilities. Translation says that a text does not exist to be repeated, that is, merely to tax the interpretative ingenuity of succeeding generations. Instead, translation says that a text must constantly retrieve its being, its capacity to be a protagonist, by renewal. It must adapt and be adapted to its changing ecology. If we say that it is the task of translation to change the posture of the source text in relation to its environment, and to demonstrate that change is necessary to it, if it is to jettison the then of its own language, then translation must root about in the visible source text for the source text's invisible, that is, for those forms of itself that it already, before translation, makes possible. When I say makes possible, I may begin to say that it is translation's task to make the potential of the source text visible and to begin to realize it. For me, translation is a process whereby the suspendedness of the potential of the source text is thrust into time, becomes a set of potential acts, variational energies latent in the source text, impatient to resolve themselves in consciousness as soon as may be, as real events. For example, in the first stanza of Baudelaire's Chant d'automne, Song of Autumn, bientôt nous plongerons dans les froides ténèbres, adieu. Vive clarté de nos étés trop courts, Now we will plunge into the frigid dark, the living light of summer gone too soon. Looking at the first line, we might ask what its invisible is. Well, for one thing, we might pick out the words that it cannot choose in its own language for metrical reasons. I mean, because of the needs of word order, or of rhyme, or because of syllabic number, or for other acoustic reasons. Thus here, Baudelaire could not replace froide by, for example, hivernal, wintry, or glacial, glacial, or givré, frosty, or indeed frigide. But this does not invalidate them as potential realizations of his thought. They constitute precisely the lines invisible, hidden only for technical reasons. So one act, froide, ténèbres, releases further potential acts, hivernal, glacial, givré, frigide, which, as we know from other poems of his, are already in Baudelaire's compositional vocabulary, but which here concerns of syllabic counting and position obstruct. Translation can thus supplement the shortcomings of the structure of French verse. Furthermore, had Baudelaire imagined this line as the 4/6 decasyllable, nous plongerons bientôt dans les ténèbres, or as the octosyllable, nous plongerons dans les ténèbres, then the translator might ask what lexical material might be invisible within them, which a 12-syllable, or indeed a multilinear rendering of them, would bring to the surface. When the translator changes a rhyme scheme in a poem, or indeed just the rhyme words, it should not be seen as a sign of failure or of making do, a patching and mending. It should be grasped as a creative opportunity to make visible what the original had not the freedom to disclose. The critic's proper response circumstances should not be X's version doesn't manage to get Y's particular poetic landscape. Rather, it should be X's version brings to light, makes possible what threatened to be unexpressed in Y's original. Let us remember that the source text should be tested as a translation of the target text by back translation, just as much as the reverse. Translation institutes an act not of derivation or imitation, but one of reciprocity, of co-authoring, of mutual writing around a text. Put another way, we might say that we need to shift from a view of choice, which works competitively by the exclusion of rivals, in order to leave only the best choice, to a view of choice which works inclusively, where choice begets other choices and looks ever to extend its range, to create new senses to move into, a tireless dialectic of potential acts, which is, after all, the very being of translation. Put yet another way, translation is a disturbance introduced into the source text, which undoes its inviolable self-sufficiency, the self-justifying constraints under which it was made, and pushes it into infinite dialectical progression. As I proceed, I must make further terminological distinctions so that my view of the proper trajectory of the translational process becomes clearer. First, the English word language is too ambiguous to serve us reliably. We must turn to French classification. And in these definitions, we simply have, of course, langage. Language splits into langage, which is the language medium as a whole. Verbal, and I want to stress non-verbal. I'm talking about all kinds of language. and then langue, the national language system, which expresses itself in parole, speech, language in performance, in situation, pragmatics. And that one of the things that I want to suggest is not only that language, langage, constantly invades langue, expanding it, pushing it apart, but also that translation wants to push langue in the direction of performance towards parole. Part of parole, of course, is paralanguage. And paralanguage, again, usually has two meanings, a kind of superordinate meaning, which involve all non-vocal phenomena accompanying speech. That is the world of gestures, kinesics, and the world of the position of speakers, proxemics. But in its subordinate meaning, it is particularly about features of the voice. Tone, tempo, pausing, intonation, accentuation, and so on. But here again, I want us to bear in mind that there is such a thing also as non-verbal paralanguage. That is to say, indications on the page itself, whether it's in layout, typography, punctuation, diacritical marks, about the way we should use our voice when we actually perform the text. For me then, in a translational context, langage is by no means a passive background, a faculty, a capacity, but an active, multilingual, multisensory, multimedial field of energies, a principle of continual intralinguistic and interlinguistic variation, constantly pushing into the space of langue, the national language, as a competing source of association and a competing resource. When I translate Apollinaire's poem Marie-Sibylle, for example, my translation is intruded upon thanks to the German setting, the street in Cologne, by German lexical items, as well as by the languages of page design and typography, and the suggestion of a photograph. As I'm reading this, it occurs to me to include the Brandt photograph of circa 1930, woman in Hamburg. And indeed, a thematically associated language of photographs, including Walker Evans, Robert Frank Brassai, Willy Ronis, Richard Avedon, Manuel Alvarez Bravo, insists on being heard. Langage, in this non-verbal sense, reveals the apparent actuality and completeness of the source text to be a delusion. Translation restores to the source text the flow of its own incompleteness. Thanks to a langage, which is now the source of potential acts, of all these reactualizations of the source text, we cannot begin to imagine its scope, its full proliferation. But we can contribute to its continuing journey through time. The now of a text is the act of reading or performance. That is, the act of investing the linguistic with the verbal and visual paralinguistic. That is to say, with, on the one hand, those features of voice, of vocal realization, which the bare text gives no indication of, features such as rhythm, tempo, loudness, intensity of stress, pausing, precision of articulation, tone, and intonation. And on the other, with non-verbal features such as photographs, new graphic signs, typefaces, page layout, which all significantly inflect the way we modalize and respond to language. Underlying the argument that one should translate from the linguistic towards the paralinguistic or performative is the belief that translation should translate from langue, the national language, towards both langage, the linguistic medium as a whole, and parole, particular manifestations of language, and more particularly from the linguistic towards the pragmatic, that is, from the language system as autonomous entity towards language in use in specific speaking contexts, in specific situations. A fundamental function of translation is then to thrust the source text into the flux of time, out of history and into historicity. I look upon history as the creation of an ordered chronological sequence in which things have a place. Having a place means both that the thing in question has no need to move, and that rather than having obligations to other things have obligations to it. The traditional stance of translation, for example, is that it has obligations to the source text and needs to work out exactly what those obligations are. There is little inquiry about what the source text's own obligations to its changing environments might be. In the historical view, the source text has achieved the status of the translatable, the fit to be translated, accessible to all national languages indifferently. In this respect, the source text has a certain documentary or evidential value which would be forfeit were one to put its textual reliability at risk. Important manifestations of history in public life are, of course, the museum and the library. The library, for example, is a repository of available stored texts to which traditionally translation adds companion copies. The library is the place of the silent book, of the organization and segregation of text types, of chronologization. Traditionally, translation supports the principles of the library, but we want a translation that undermines those principles. The museum, for its part, as the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty points out, fosters the sombre pleasures of retrospection, this contemplative spirit of the necropolis. But most germane to our argument that translation should jettison history in favour of historicity is Merleau-Ponty's capital observation about the museum. He writes, "Whereas style lived within each painter like his heartbeat, and was precisely what enabled him to recognise every effort which differed from his own, the museum converts this secret, modest, non-deliberated, involuntary, and in short, living historicity into official and pompous history." Here we begin to see some of the values that flow from historicity. Its improvised, exploratory, intuitive nature, its contingency, and above all, its being caught in the very quick of experience, of existence. Translation traces the associative itinerary of the reading consciousness, which is no respecter of chronology, of cause and effect, which refuses completeness, which refuses that exclusion of variance, of alternative choices, whereby the target text might achieve an historical identity. What translation aims at is the impossibility of the source text's recovering its place in the sequence of history by relocating it in a world of linguistic mutability, of constantly renegotiated ecological relationships, of unending self-discovery. That is, in the world of historicity. Translation, we say, does not produce the meaning of the source text so much as intensify, complicate, problematize perhaps our relationship with it, our experience of it. About this claim, two things should immediately be said. First, we must remember that we're arguing for a translation for the polyglot reader. The polyglot reader has no need of the meaning of the source text, since he or she can recuperate that for him or herself. As we've intimated, what translation primarily deals with is invisible, those dimensions of the source text which give it depth, give it its multiple senses. Second, if we deprecate meaning, it is because it takes us out of the language of the text and justifies Saussure's axiom about the arbitrariness of the relationship between the signifier and the signified, justifying the target text's regarding itself as a metalinguistic interpretation of the source text. But as I have before insisted, the target text is not the signified of the source text signifier. The target text is another signifier, whose difference from the source text allows it to cast a more penetrating light on the source text's capacity to signify, catches the signifier of the source text unawares, as it were. And the capacity to signify is not the capacity to mean, to convert words into stable values, concepts, as enumerated and self-sufficient items in a dictionary. It is rather the capacity to generate sense, and with it, the activity of the senses. This distinction between meaning and sense is crucial to my case. Meaning is something which is seen to inhere in language by virtue of lexical and cultural embeddedness. It is something which, however ambiguous, however plural, must be respected and cannot be denied, something which has claims to make. But we must be careful, or else meaning will subdue the translator, demand its dues overbearingly and without right, because meaning is, in fact, in a permanent state of obsolescence, as Benjamin pointed out. Sense, on the other hand, has constantly to be made, but it is elusive. It multiplies, diversifies, escapes, or holds itself at a distance just beyond our grasp. It is an integral part of the source text's progress through time and space, a guarantee of that progress, and both sense and progress are dependent on the efforts that the readers and translators of the source text are prepared to make in pursuit of them. Translation, then, is not the extraction of meaning from a text in order to perpetuate it. Translation is an account of a sense-making of the source text by the translator, a sense-making which has written into it the activity of the readerly consciousness and the play of the readerly senses. And if the source text has to be made sense of repeatedly, it is because source texts cease to be comprehensible to themselves shortly after their production and progressively lose their meaning. Source texts are nomadic texts in search of themselves, in search of a place in the world, in search of an ever-renewed expressive energy. In a word, then, translation does not recuperate meaning, but generates sense, as it generates the future of the source text. In my last book, Translating Apollinaire, I tried visually to capture this spontaneous combustion of sense and its volatility by using fragments of photographs or small contact prints. These are some of the translations from the photographic fragment requires the eye to look more fleetingly, less possessively, less insistently, with a more dynamic responsiveness than it does with a full photograph. With a photographic fragment, the eye doesn't stare or gaze because such a perceptual mode is unproductive. The eye traverses, flickers, glimpses, intuits, guesses, constantly feeding itself on new patterns of circulation, just as translation is a linguistic glimpsing, intuiting, traversing, sense-making, as it constantly reinvents the circulation of languages. Photographic fragments install the nervous, mobile spectator whose relationship with the image is piecemeal, distracted, incomplete, ever renewed. Through these photographic eruptions and interpolations, the reader does not submit to the meditative time of the text, or rather does not allow it a meditative time. He or she looks instead for the restless activity of the text, its being in progress, the progress of self-formation. I want briefly to consider three ways: time, colour as metaphor of sense, and situation, in which translation might be said to multiply and intensify this kind of aspectual volatility in words. First, I wish to return to the opening lines of Baudelaire's Chant d'automne. Bientôt nous plongerons dans les froides ténèbres. Adieu. Vive clarté de nos étés trop courts. In reading text, we rarely concern ourselves with the temporal complexity, the flickering shifts in time and temporal perception that make any apparently unified existential condition, be it regret, angst, foreboding, despair, a restless field of conflicting energies. In bientôt, soon, bien has lost a lot of its expressives. But in my translation, I want to reaffirm its urgency, the inescapability of its imminence. The future tense of nous plongerons bespeaks a certainty, but the collective nous might mean us severally, a repeated act over a period, or us altogether at once. The latter seems more likely, makes nous, us, victims without choice, when we seemed to be agents as subjects of the verb. I want to give this act both unsuspected suddenness and to hide its source. The preposing of the adjective froide, on the other hand, shifts its role from a neutrally descriptive one, which it would have as a post-posed adjective, to a temporally and spatially diffusive, expanding one. Froide is now an inhabited state, as figurative as it is literal. It is a decelerative adjective, a lingering apprehension, froide de ténèbres. Ténèbres, on the other hand, swallows time. Then, in the next line, adieu looks in the other temporal direction, back over the shoulder. But vive, again preposed, superimposes a remembered present, momentarily countering froide. Like froide, it attracts an exploratory lingering of the voice. Vive clarté, an attempt to rebuild the richness of the experience. In both froide and vive, the intention to dwell in the experience is partly provided by the effect of the articulated E mute, which lengthens the syllable before it. Froide, vive. But while froide has a full tonic accent, vive has not, and it is clarté which acts as the accentual peak, and so on and so on. Temporal perspective, degree of duration implied, changes constantly from word to word, and in my attempt to get these first two lines, I come up with too soon. Immersion in the wintry tree shadows. Adieu. Live and lively brightness of summers too soon gone. Second, I want to look at colour. In Rilke's poem, Blaue Hortensie, blue hydrangea. So wie das letzte Grün in Fabeltitel. Colour is both a perfect example and a metaphor of sense, a metaphorical use of colour with which we have long been familiar. It is not then the descriptive functioning of colours nor their symbolism with which we are concerned, but rather with their changing impurities, with their varied tones, their metamorphoses under changing atmospheric conditions, the qualities they draw from the different materials they inhabit. I do not derive meanings from colours, I espouse their lives, their expressive energies. So we have Rilke's poem and a translation. These leaves, so like the last green left in colour dishes, dull, dry, rough, behind the flowering umbels, whose blues, as if detached, reflected from way off. Before turning to comments on the poem, I'd like briefly to consider the following table of colours across these three languages, English, French, and German. This table has two functions. First, to make the simple underlying point that translation as circulation of languages, as readerly consciousness alive to cross-linguistic variation, makes us peculiarly sensitive to the acousticity of colour and of the ways in which that acousticity affects our perception of the hues, tones, blendings of colour, their extensiveness and duration. What is it that makes initial BL, blue, across all three languages, and initial R, red? When it comes to colour sound, etymology is of little significance. Why is blue in all an open syllable, not followed by a consonant? And why in all languages is it rounded, but rounded in rather different ways? Blue, bleu. Is blue more expansive in German than in French, just as red is deeper in German than in English? Why does red end in dental plosives in English and German? The one voiced, red, the other voiceless, rot, while in French it ends in a voiced fricative, which relates it immediately to jaune, rouge, jaune. But then in English, red and yellow share the same front unrounded, half-open vowel e, as is also found in German yellow, gelb. What does the second syllable in English yellow add to its tonality or density or fixity? And so on, and so on, and so on. My second point is equally simple, that colour words, allowed to consort with each other and to cross-contaminate each other, remind us that colours are not unified and discrete, but unstable complexities. Rilke's poem is located between two sets of grammatical coordinates. First, the parts of speech that colours are, pure substantive, gelb in ihnen, violett und grau, substantival adjective, ein rührend blaues, or vor grünem, and adjective, in alten blauen Briefpapieren. And second, the articles by which colours are accompanied, zero article, definite article, and indefinite article. The hydrangea is the trigger and site of colour's metamorphoses and its self-pursuit. In The Visible and the Invisible, in two passages, one on red and one on yellow, Merleau-Ponty allows us to see how colour is not so much an identifying characteristic of a specific object as something like a gravitational nexus, a gathering point of different multiplicities, texture, material, hue, reflection, sense, environmental chromatic activity, synesthesia, historical and cultural overtones, depending on particular context. At the same time, colour transcends any particular manifestation. A particular instance of red is a red activated by and opening onto all and any reds. It is red as an element like fire, air, water, earth in the universe, as elusive and multiform as it is constitutive. So, in my versions of Blaue Hortensie, I have, it's this sequence. I have entitled the poem simply Hydrangea, in order to avoid predicting any colour and prejudicing response, in order to let colour emerge under its own impetus. I have then reduced the body of the poem to its colour skeleton and used the multiplicity of versions to enact the instability of sense in the instability of the senses. The hydrangea, now a sheet of paper, now its writtenness, becomes a kind of palette on which colours are constantly remixed and redistributed among themselves, caught up in the endless play of changing atmospherics. Here, as we have said, colour acts as a metaphor of sense. Sense is like colour inasmuch as it has a volatile quality, is not a concept. Impressionism has taught us not only to view colour as non-local, non-ontological, but as responsive to atmospheric conditions, light, other colours, reflections, bouncing particles, attraction of complementaries, as something which changes not only in intensity and hue, but in the range of other colours it attracts to itself. This is how sense works, and Rilke's Blaue Hortensie dramatises both the senses that blue lives through and blue as the figure of self-generating sense. While Blaue Hortensie takes place in an indicative mood, writing, reading, sense-making take place in what we might think of as the subjunctive mood. In reading, simply register a text, we modalize it, we fill it with fantasy, with virtuality. Rilke's characteristic of wie, als ob, like as if, responsiveness akin in nature to that of the reader, or indeed translator. Given our emphasis on translation as performance of the source text, whether that performance is on the page in layout and typography or of the page, it is hardly surprising that finally I should canvass the situational immediacy provided by the paralinguistic, the activity of voice and vision. Voice and typography and all their resources coax words into different postures of sense and sense-making, change their colouring, their effective charge, and do so in an urgent here and now. This too is a process of disclosure. Disclosure of what the text does not make visible, its depth. The depth which lies in its capacity to be expressively multidimensional, to activate voices, voicings, ways of being experience or consciousness in the mouth. But these are dimensions that only the reader or translator can unearth, and of which the notion of fidelity to the text shows no awareness. To illustrate this point a little, I want to return to Baudelaire, but to another of his poems, Brumes et pluies, Mists and Rains, and begin by talking a little about rhythm and meter and their relation to situatedness. Rhythm is a situational vocal imprinting whereby the speaking subject coincides with, makes contact with, language as specific situational reference. This is something that meter does not do. Meter is a template for the organization of discourse, such that discourse precisely establishes or confirms the meter. To translate from a meter, say the French Alexandrine, into another meter, say English iambic pentameter, therefore achieves of itself no deepening of the experience of the source text, of the cross-cultural encounter. It is of course possible to approach meter rhythmically, to make heard not the repetition of pattern, but the engagement of voice with verbal material, the changing quality of accentuation, for example, of intonational segmentation, of pausing, of tempo and dynamics. But here, as ever, we must be clear about three things. First, rhythm is voice-related, paralinguistic. Second, it is grounded in succession and continuity, but not in recurrence perhaps, but not repetition. Thirdly, it is multidimensional in a way that metre is not. Where metre concerns only syllable and stress, rhythm concerns all those features of paralanguage that we've enumerated: pausing, tempo, dynamics, accentual quality, etc. The idea of translating the rhythm of one text, but no text has only one rhythm, into the rhythm of another text in any direct sense is as impossible as it is misguided. The task must be to translate the source text into rhythm, which is not to say that the source text is not itself rhythmic, but that the rhythms of the target text are modes of auscultation, of listening to the internal organs of the source text, means of finding or creating a life peculiar to its depth, or what we have called its invisible. Rhythm is a form of expressive perception, of expressive empathy, of Einsehen or Einfühlung, in-seeing or in-feeling, as one might say in German. This, then, is a translation: autumn ends and wintering and muddied springs, seasons to fall asleep to, how not to love them and to celebrate their wrapping round my heart and brain, a misty winding sheet, a dimly outlined grave. Here we see that rhythm is clearly not about feet, but is rather about phrasal segments or phonological units. What we hear are sequences which sometimes share a syntactico-rhythmic structure, for example, in this vast plain, in the swirls, through the long nights, but frequently do not. And here we see too that a dynamic disposition or layout underlines the interplay of the different rhythmic elements: intonation, pausing, tone, tempo, and so on. Margins, spacing, alignments are all different kinds of consciousness acting on text, adjusting, inflecting voice. How exactly these perceptions express themselves in a voice is a matter for each individual reader, but the translator can exert certain kinds of vocal persuasion to affiliations, pausing. The second version computer-generated with accompanying adjustments, and in 2 columns, adopts a contrary route. Whereas in the previous version, the target text was its own score, its own scansion, a writing which was simultaneously its own voicing, we are here confronted with modes of writing with which the voice is unfamiliar, modes of writing which challenge the voice to find a path, and in doing so to uncover latencies in the text which the chances of disposition themselves make available to us. The computer acts as a kind of surrealist automatic writing. In this sense, we're reading ourselves into the designs of the page's layout, as though the layout itself could create the poem. Layout is, after all, composition. But this is not quite all. The text we have before us, again by purely dispositional means, promotes properties which are unnatural to the voice and which we usually do not hear as separate acoustic experience. Layout works like a prosthetic for voice, compels the voice to examine its resources microscopically and to extend its range. Layout traces the dynamics of the production of language, and layout is able to dramatize that dynamics, to suggest, as we've seen, that utterance may wish to eschew fluency in the interests of self-exploration and self-enrichment, or that the voice's coming to language is a more fraught and problematic process the more language is thought and felt as it is produced. It is experimental layout which ensures that reading is informed by an awareness of the larger patterns of utterance, the sound characteristics which affect whole sequences of syllables, so-called prosodic features. And these larger patterns of utterance are, of course, the principal bearers of paralinguistic features. It is too easy to regard paralinguistic features, whether oral or visual, and by visual paralanguage, as I've said, I mean layout, typefaces, punctuation, graphic interventions, as a supplement to meaning, as the circumstances of its realization, as if it already existed and simply needed to be clothed. But paralanguage has the power to make sense swerve and change, and to persuade us that sense does not inhere in language, but in what paralanguage bestows on language. Here is just a little mucking about with the notion of sorrow and what it feels like in different typefaces, and whether one can feel a change. And then a translation of that first line, sois sage, which includes sorrow, ô ma douleur, et tiens-toi plus tranquille. And then, as you see, various typographic reimaginings of that line. Translation, then, is not an object, a product, a result. It is a certain way of using language, a way of using language with certain kinds of consciousness. As a translator, faced with language not my own, I need ever again to relocate myself, to reorientate myself, to show to myself that I can say it in my own language. Translation, we might say, is the constant resurrection of language, in the sense that langage returns us to the state of Babel, where the accents of all languages are available to us, and out of which we must forge an utterance, a kind of linguistic act, which is not a manifestation of langue, a return to the already codified system, but more like a bricolage, a creative improvisation. Thank you.
Clive, thank you. We have time for questions, and we can perhaps even go a little beyond the 11:15 that is in the schedule to take questions. I'm sure there will be plenty. Philip.
Thank you very much, Clive. That was great. What about, this is all about interlingual, three languages. What about intralingual translation?
Yes.
Should GCSE teachers be doing with Shakespeare, for example?
Yes. But that I don't see why the interlingual and the intralingual are not continuous. In fact, that and that they're. I'm just actually that this kind of thing actually is often used simply as a pedagogical aid, isn't it, in language teaching, and that there is no reason it shouldn't translate English into English. Using exactly the same kinds of principle, I mean, of readerly response, of textual experience, in order to find within that text other texts. So that I think the intralingual dimension, which so often in fact gets forgotten, doesn't it, is extremely important, in fact.
I think you're right. I think it's used as a pedagogical tool in schools, for example. It's not really done professionally, and you don't see many published versions of it.
No.
That's the problem.
No. I mean, that one should just say, obviously, that talking about translation in this way has huge, or at least as far as I can see, huge pedagogical implications. Because this idea of translation studies itself as something which has been institutionalized, one might argue, runs against new kinds of pedagogy, which involve a much, much more uncontrollable and creative factor. That we still, the sense of, teaching isn't just about learning stuff. It's actually about the exploration of students. And that somehow we haven't managed quite to get hold of.
Thank you very much.
Do you think, though, that there is something in the linguistic displacement that is brought about by a change of language that adds potential for different readings of an original text from which we would get if we were translating interlingually. Do you think that the experience of interlingual translation necessarily adds other dimensions that we're not going to encounter simply through the process of interlingual?
Yes, I mean, it's, as it were, psychologically easier to do the kind of things that I'm talking about interlingually than it is intralingually. That one feels that there's something perhaps more artificial, that when one comes to take, I don't know what, any kind of, say, English text and translate it into an English text, the resistances are much, much kind of greater, so that the value of the interlingual connection is that it makes this process easier, but one would also have to emphasize that what one is also talking about is a process whereby one comes to live with much greater freedom within other languages. It's the circulation of languages, it's the improvisation of language that one is hoping translation itself is going to encourage. And the thing which about intralingual translation, of course, is that dimension is rather harder to cultivate and foster. But that this sense that immediately you translate not bilingually, but with a multilingual consciousness, seems to me an important one. And of course, the Caribbean writer Edouard Glissant talks about not having to know lots of other languages, but having to have an imagination of lots of other languages. That's the really vital and precious thing that, as it were, loosens up the interlinguistic being of the translator.
Yes.
I was particularly interested in, you brought in some of the non-verbal and the layout aspects on that side, and I was just wondering whether you see a sort of a boundary between when it's translation and when it's creative response or illustration, or whether it is more fluid between the two of them. Would you find a difference?
I mean, my own view is that in a sense translation doesn't have any boundaries or frontiers, or since what we're actually arguing for is an anti-frontier, that one of the big drawbacks of both translation for the monoglot reader and for bilingual translation is that it is frontier inspired. It derives its justification from the fact that there is apparently a boundary that the monoglot reader, and that the kinds of preoccupation that grow up in translation studies, things like untranslatability, for instance, are also orientated. This idea that they're, and that what one wants to say is translation isn't about that at all. Translation is by nature diversifying, diversificatory, and that therefore what it shifts across one cannot tell. I mean, what number of boundaries it might cross seem to me to be, it seems pointless to create any parameters, really.
Question over here.
Thank you very much for an interesting paper. And I do agree that translation can be, especially creative translation, can be considered as a mode of writing. But my question is, do you consider the border between adaptation and translation? And in this case, does original play the same role as in ordinary translation? Does it make any important role in this case, the interpretation?
But, sorry, that you then are talking about a relationship between two different visions of what translation...
Translation and adaptation.
And adaptation.
Yes.
Because I think that one of the standard things about adaptation is probably that it is more inclined to look at the so-called original as a challenge than I think that I would imagine for translation. And it is also, as it were, can often justify itself on the watertightness of different media. That when one's thinking about adaptation, one is always thinking about, isn't one crossing from one medium into another? And so that the notion of equivalence and so on becomes crucial in a way that I think that translation itself should in some ways resist. Again, largely because equivalence is bound up with border thinking, quite apart from the fact, equivalent in what respect remains a completely a deadly question that it's almost impossible to answer. But the idea that adaptation and translation are rather different undertakings, I think, which has been pretty strong up until now, is something which perhaps even from people who write about adaptation is beginning to break down. And I know that, I think, has anyone read this? I mean, that, for example, Venuti has expressed opinions about what adaptation can learn from translation and so on, so that there is a kind of treaty being made, I think, between those two exercises.
Clive, I wonder if I might ask you about one aspect of your model which it wasn't clear to me where it would have a place, and that's intertextuality.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether that is an aspect of what you're referring to as the history versus the historicity of the source text, because I was thinking with your example from the Chant d'automne, I hear in those opening lines, I hear Je suis le ténébreux, le vif. In the Blaue Hortensia, I think of the Blaue Blume, and I think of Novalis. Yeah. And, I'm sure any reader is going to be reminded and find resonances of other literary examples there. And I'm just wondering then where intertextuality might fit in to your account, which is rich in so many ways in accounting for the reader's experience, but perhaps I'm just too scholarly a reader, and I'm always thinking of other examples. But
I mean, there are two things about that. The first is connected with the fact that intertextuality itself obviously is a hugely problematic notion, simply because it's uncontrollable. And is deeply related to different subjectivities and what associative mechanisms actually operate within the brain. And that therefore trying to make of intertextuality, I think, some kind of something that can be built into our understanding of the literary discipline is a rather dangerous thing. Obviously, one might want to say, oh, well, look, just a minute, we've got to make distinctions between, associative intertextuality and citational intertextuality and so on. But again, in the end, that if what you're trying is to generate richness and fruitfulness in the reader, actually making those kind of distinctions itself is... And the other thing to bear in mind is that when you then think about text and you think about what is going into text then, in the translation kind of that you are imagining, because you're not going somewhere quietly to vacuum, taking a text and translating it and saying, God, there's this linguistic problem, there's that linguistic problem, there's that. You're actually in the real world now, in a space, in a particular kind of mood and all that kind of stuff, and you're sitting down and you're saying, what translation is thrusting this text into my life as it is now. So I need to think there is the textual, yeah, but there's the hypertextual, which is the intertextual, always wanting to be heard, so that the text itself wants to drift off. And that with the things like photographs at the beginning, I'm also trying to imagine in which the environment itself in which you're translating is a meaningful thing, because it's part of the way that you are actually reconciling your text to a world around you. It is not, translation isn't a purely textual exercise outside time. It's deeply in time. And, you know, it's things like intertext. To make a connection, Blauer Hortensia and Blauer Blumen, for instance, that's going a bit far, or that is a tenuous connection, let's say, or that it would be awful to say that. You can't put, you know, Blauer Blumen coming into your head. It's part of the experience you have with the text, and therefore needs somehow to be accounted for. So the intertextual is a hugely important part of it, but it's one that I think one has to be careful of not making into, you know, that there is a kind of sense in which a notion like intertextuality, if it's absorbed into a discipline, must somehow become something respectable, and isn't the anarchic thing that it actually is. Oh, crikey, that makes me think of, my God, that reminds me of my mum saying, you know, I like these blue roses, you know. And of course, the institution would turn to you and say, what the hell are you talking about? And yet, in one's own relationship with the world, it's rather important.
Thank you. Just one perhaps final question at the back here.
Okay, I'll try and make it quick then. So, first of all, thank you very much. I'm wondering, you're calling for a philosophical approach, so not what does the text mean, but what approaches or philosophical paradigm can I use to identify possible meanings that I can then rewrite. So I'm wondering about the concept of the translator as being situated there in their own culture and upbringing, from a differential point of view in different societies and language systems where philosophical approaches are either more or less accepted, let's say, between the Anglophone and the Francophone world. Do you see that as an issue or consideration?
No, I mean, I think, again, largely because on the whole, this, you must accept, sorry that I say this knowing that it's a ridiculous thing to say, but that I dislike very, very much the way that notions of culture themselves are used to justify different kinds of attitude, as though we were all in the straitjackets of cultural upbringing and everything else, and that we didn't live in a world which precisely seems to want to get rid of a lot of cultural, and that is to say, to replace the notion of what cultures demand by, let's say, the notion of human rights, quite simply. You know, that this again is it seems to me a kind of contradiction that we somehow live uncomfortably with. But cultures are a way, again, of disqualifying certain kinds of things or objecting to them, when, in fact, we are culturally extremely versatile individuals, extremely resilient, I think, and should be encouraged to be so. That is to say that I'm not saying, we don't recognise that, you know, fox hunting is a peculiarly British thing or something. But even when I say that, one can see how awful it would be to think like that, you know, that every time one comes into contact with something, that somehow it becomes culturally labelled and so on. So the idea behind this kind of translation is precisely that it should feel that there aren't cultural barriers either that each individual just finds their way into the world that they want to inhabit, as it were, in connection with a text.
Okay, I think we're going to need to draw things to a close there. We have a coffee break now, and then we're reconvening in room 102, is that right? Or 103, so on the first floor, in other words. But the coffee is downstairs in the foyer where we had registration, and we'll start again at about 10:02. So we'll have a 20-minute break now for coffee. But before we do so, can I ask you to join me in thanking once again Clive Scott for a wonderful presentation.